Good morning, everyone. Still, a few people are trickling in, but I think it's about time to start. We don't want to get delayed. We have a long day ahead of us. This third day of Insight, I feel like we're in some kind of vortex. It's all starting to just spin around me. For those who don't know me, my name is Marvin Däumchen. I'll be hosting this first leg of our philosophy track this morning. Next to me is Chris Letheby, who I will introduce in a minute. But first, I have some more organizational announcements for you guys to move into a smooth day. So obviously, I wish you all a very pleasant and insightful day full of exchange. And I wanted to let you know that as the audience, and also many of you as speakers, will receive emails from us tonight, I think at 6 p.m., that will ask you to fill out a survey in which you can, it's just one question, in which you can vote on your preferred award winner. So there will be an audience award. Perhaps it's going to be you, Chris, who knows? And speakers will also receive the survey with 3 questions for the best clinical research presentation, best poster, and best basic research presentation. So this is coming tonight. Also, we have the Insight Conference party tonight that I hope you will have a great time. Don't play too late because tomorrow will still be another highlight. We'll continue philosophical and societal discussions then. But no more. It's time now to finally introduce our speaker who traveled from afar, Chris Letheby. Now, Dr. Chris Letheby is a philosopher and a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Western Australia. Chris Letheby is also a longtime member of our scientific advisory board and curated last year's philosophy series in psychedelics. This is all online. I think you will find it on YouTube. I believe it's definitely worth watching. His areas of specialization are philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science. And his research interests include the causal mechanisms and epistemic status of transformative spiritual practices, the possibility of a naturalistic spirituality, and the nature of the self and self-awareness. Also, I believe it was last year that your book, Philosophy of Psychedelics, came out. 2 years already. It's the pandemic. It all just melts into each other, which I very much recommend looking into. And if you have a copy with you, maybe there can be a chance to have a signage later. By the way, also, welcome to our online audience. There are many people at home or elsewhere in the world watching and hopefully also participating in our talks. As always, there will be a Q&A after the session. And of course, please also ask questions online. Now, without further ado, please, Chris, and welcome, Chris.
All right, thank you, Marvin, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm amazed and very grateful that this room is full when you could all be listening to luminaries like Roland Griffiths and Gould Dolan, not to mention Henrik Jungerbell. So thank you very much for being here. I now feel like I have to make it worth your while. I was genuinely expecting there might be about 3 or 4 people in the room, and I was quite relieved at that prospect. So now I feel like I need to lift my game. All right, so this talk is definitely too long for 20 minutes, but I'm going to try and solve that problem by really skating quickly through the material that will be very familiar to this audience. So it's in 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about the use of classic serotonergic psychedelics in palliative care, and you're probably all fairly familiar with those facts, so I won't need to spend too long there. Second, I'm going to talk about this project that's been proposed in philosophy called the Neuroexistentialist project, which is basically, in brief, the use of evidence and theory from the mind and brain sciences to try and address a supposed new wave of existential anxiety that is alleged to be resulting from advances in the mind and brain sciences themselves. So I'll talk a bit about that, and obviously, there's some potential application of psychedelics to this neuroexistentialist project, but considering that application raises certain questions about how psychedelics work. And so in part 3, which is by far the longest part of the talk, I'm going to start examining mechanistic questions about how exactly psychedelics cause lasting psychological benefits, in particular alleviations of death anxiety and existential distress, and how their ability to do this relates to their therapeutic potential more broadly. So that's the overview. All right, palliative psychedelics. You all know what classic psychedelics are, I think. Psychoactive serotonin 2A receptor agonists, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and so forth. They've had long histories of indigenous use. They can induce profound changes to conscious experience, and we're currently in the midst of a third wave of scientific interest in these substances. Now, so far, what we've found in 30 or so years of renewed research is that psychedelics can indeed be given safely in controlled conditions at moderate or even high doses. We've found out that they tend to modulate the activity and connectivity of these large-scale brain networks, the default mode and salience network, among others. And of course, there's quite a lot of evidence for therapeutic potential. So the paradigm of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, in which typically 1 to 3 supervised high doses are given in conjunction with some kind of psychological therapy, seems to lead to rapid, large, and sustained reductions in symptoms of various conditions, anxiety, depression, addiction. We've also seen studies seeming to show transformative potential in healthy subjects, so people without a clinical diagnosis experiencing lasting increases in various markers of well-being after 1 or 2 or 3 supervised high-dose psychedelic sessions. And importantly for my purposes, there are quite a lot of studies now showing that these lasting benefits, whether they be reductions in psychiatric symptoms or increases in markers of well-being, are predicted by various psychological variables, so various aspects of the acute psychedelic experience itself. So we've got these constructs like the mystical type experience, oceanic boundlessness, emotional breakthrough, feelings of psychological insight. There are measures to quantify all these types of experiences people can have under psychedelics, and there's quite a bit of evidence showing that having one or another of these sorts of experiences during the acute drug effects correlates with having good, lasting outcomes. So at the time I wrote this talk, the best studied therapeutic indication in modern published research was actually the alleviation of anxiety, depression, and existential distress in people with a terminal diagnosis, a diagnosis of terminal illness. This may no longer be the case, I'm not too sure, because there have been quite a few studies on depression come out in the last couple of years, including one just in the last couple of days. But in any case, there's a fair bit of evidence, including 2 decently sized randomized controlled trials that came out 7 years ago now with a total of 80 subjects showing benefits lasting up to 4 years after psychedelic administration. And so I think when we combine these findings of lasting reductions in anxiety, depression, and existential distress in terminally ill patients with the other studies that seem to show lasting increases in well-being in healthy subjects, a thought arises, which is that maybe psychedelics can have existential or psycho-spiritual applications for seekers, as we might say, so people who are kind of interested in spirituality, interested in finding meaning in life and addressing existential questions, or the worried well, as they're sometimes called. So that's a thought that occurs to me when I put this research on palliative psychedelics side by side with the research on transformative effects in healthy subjects. And so this brings us to the Neuroexistentialist project. So what is this project? Well, the philosophers Owen Flanagan and Greg Caruso, around the same time, interestingly, that these RCTs of palliative psilocybin came out, suggested that advances in the neurosciences are leading to a new and distinctive wave of existential anxiety. And the claim is that basically, with every stride that the mind and brain sciences make in mapping the physical material bases of all these kind of cherished and seemingly special human functions, so capacities like self-awareness, decision-making, emotion, and so on, certain uncomfortable realities become plainer and plainer. Namely, we are smart, to be sure, but nonetheless merely material, evolved mortal animals, and we don't seem to have any of the things that we've classically believed or like to hope we might have. We don't seem to have any immortal soul. We don't seem to have any objective purpose for our existence. We don't seem to have any contra-causal free will. In other words, any ability to choose what we do independent of causal determinants or prior events. And so Flanagan and Caruso claim, and I'm not going to take a stand here on whether this is true or not, I'll just assume for the sake of argument that they're broadly right. They claim that this increasing neuroscientific mapping of the material bases of our cognition and consciousness is leading to this new wave of existential anxiety as this reality that we are merely mortal, kind of evolved beings becomes clearer and clearer. And so they call this the neuroexistentialist predicament, the predicament of having these scientific disciplines not just tell us in abstract terms, but make clear in ever-increasing detail that we are these, contingent and ultimately purposeless beings. And so they make this interesting proposal, which is that we turn to the source of the problem to try and find solutions. So they say this could be the silver lining of these advances in the mind and brain sciences that are putting us in this neuroexistentialist predicament, is that as they give us more and more insight into how our minds and brains work, they might also point towards a solution. They might be able to tell us something about how we can find meaning, how we can flourish, how we can live well and have kind of happy, good human lives in light of an awareness of our situation as purely material beings in a purely natural world. So that is the neuroexistentialist project, right? The attempt to find in the evidence and theory of the mind and brain sciences solutions to this neuroexistentialist predicament that allegedly is resulting from the findings of those very sciences. So I think the potential relevance of psychedelic research to the neuroexistentialist project is obvious. Nonetheless, I'm going to say a little bit about what I take it to be. So we have here a new wave of scientific research into what can broadly be called a neurotechnological intervention that seems able to reduce existential distress and to restore a sense of meaning, hope, and purpose. And you find this if you look at the, not just the quantitative psychometric research, but also qualitative interviews, first-person accounts of people kind of undergoing this treatment in palliative contexts. They very clearly describe experiencing a restored sense of meaning and hope and purpose and becoming reconciled to mortality and these kinds of things. So there are at least two options, right? Two paths we could pursue here. The really direct one is, well, let's look at the possibility of giving people psychedelics to overcome neuroexistentialist anxiety. And the less direct and perhaps more politically palatable approach is, let's try and learn from psychedelics, right? Let's see if we can understand the mechanisms whereby they bring about these salutary changes and harness those same psychological processes in some less druggy type of way. So those are the two paths we could pursue, and of course they're not mutually exclusive. But whichever one we consider, there's an epistemological concern. And so for the non-philosophers in the room, this is my major piece of philosophical jargon. Epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge. So epistemological means relating to knowledge or its study. I'll also use the term epistemic, which just means relating to knowledge. So Michael Pollan, a few years before his best-selling book came out, wrote an article in the New Yorker on precisely the use of psychedelics in a palliative care context, to alleviate this sort of existential distress in people with a terminal diagnosis. And he asked this memorable question that has motivated most of my academic research on psychedelics, my philosophical work. Is psychedelic therapy simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying? And so where Pollan is coming from here is that there is this very strong correlation. I mean, earlier I just mentioned in broad terms correlations between psychological variables quantifying the acute psychedelic experience and good outcomes. But the most common such correlation, especially in this end-of-life terminal illness context, is between ratings of mystical type experience and good clinical outcomes. And so when you look at the way a mystical type experience is defined, it's an experience as of transcending time and space, a sense of profound unity, feelings of sacredness, and importantly, the so-called noetic quality, the feeling that one is gaining direct, undeniable, unmediated knowledge of ultimate reality. And so if you look at this finding, the fact that, people with a terminal illness are given high doses of psychedelics, and it's the ones who have this type of experience specifically that seem to experience reductions in existential distress, anxiety, and depression. If you look at this from the sort of standpoint that Pollan and I have, which is broadly a philosophically naturalist or materialist standpoint, the idea that, the natural world is all there is no kind of non-physical mind, no supernatural reality, consciousness, human consciousness begins and ends with the human brain, then this starts to look a bit worrying, right? And the thought is that perhaps psychedelic use is less a way to make peace with naturalism than a means to become persuaded of its falsity. And that might be very good for us from an emotional standpoint, but it doesn't seem very good in terms of the Neuroexistentialist project. If our project is to live good, happy, flourishing lives in light of an awareness of our situation as merely evolved, mortal, purposeless beings, then becoming persuaded of the falsity of that worldview doesn't really seem like a solution to the problem. So that's the worry that I want to try and address, if I can get the clicker to work. We might just be stuck on the comforting delusion objection for the rest of time. Comforting delusions from here to eternity. Thanks. Okay, thanks, Marvin. We can move on. Fortunately, we're not stuck in comforting delusions. So, all right, the comforting delusion objection, as I call it, this concern raised by Michael Pollan, interestingly conjoins a mechanistic claim with an epistemic claim. So it claims that psychedelics help in these kinds of situations by inducing false beliefs. So you have there conjoined a claim about mechanistically how they actually bring about these effects, as well as a claim about the epistemic status of the beliefs they're inducing. And so to evaluate this objection, we need to know, well, how do psychedelics actually produce lasting psychological benefits? Now, there are several general theories of psychedelic therapy that have been advanced to date. Few, if any, of them focus very much on reductions in death anxiety and existential distress. And so I think completely aside from these sort of neuroexistentialist concerns, this makes reductions in fear of death a very interesting and important test case, right? Because for some of these theories, it's just not clear how well they can do explaining this particular effect of psychedelic therapy. So here's an obvious idea that is pretty rarely defended explicitly, but I think is often assumed. Psychedelic therapy works by the induction of comforting metaphysical beliefs. So metaphysical beliefs in what Alan Watts famously called a joyous cosmology, some picture of the universe that is directly opposed to the sort of disenchanted neuroexistentialist image, according to which there really is some ultimate meaning or purpose, and there is perhaps some kind of universal mind or cosmic consciousness underlying the universe. Now, as I say, this theory is rarely explicitly formulated and defended in an academic context, but you find it being assumed. I mean, it's certainly implicit in Pollan's question. This is the kind of thing he's worried about. And it's a very natural thought, given the correlation between acute mystical type experience and lasting psychological benefits. And of course, it's especially intuitive in palliative care, when people who are very distressed about their own impending death suddenly have dramatic and lasting reductions in that distress. But I don't think this theory ultimately turns out to be plausible. For one thing, at least some studies have started to suggest that the picture is more complicated and have found that other variables such as psychological insight predict lasting benefits more strongly. So there's the beginnings of a signal there that this construct of a mystical type experience might actually just be a proxy for something else, right? So it might not be the feelings of sacredness and noetic quality and so on that are really healing people, but something else that correlates more or less with those kinds of experiences. And I think this thought is further bolstered when we look at findings from qualitative studies, right? When we go beyond the purely quantitative, the psychometric data, and ask, well, what do successfully treated patients actually say is going on? Here are some of the things they say, right? So here are the main themes. There was a review by Just Brixema and colleagues of qualitative research into psychedelic therapy, and they say the main themes that come up again and again in all these qualitative studies are insights, altered self-perceptions, feelings of connectedness, transcendental experiences, and expanded emotional spectrum. And number 4, transcendental experiences, is the only one of those that really points at all towards a kind of non-naturalistic worldview, a joyous cosmology or something like that. And even then it's ambiguous, right? Because what exactly is a transcendental experience? But all the rest of this, expanded emotional spectrum, altered self-perception, all of this sounds like stuff that is quite independent of altered metaphysical beliefs about the nature of reality. So there are some reasons to doubt that the metaphysical belief theory is the real story. I'm going to skip through. I've got more quotes to kind of drive this point home, but I think I'm running quite low on time, so I'm going to 5 minutes. That is low for my purposes, so I'm going to keep skipping along. Just basically, here are Bogenschutz et al. Summarizing the findings of a qualitative study of psilocybin for alcohol dependence. And they claim exactly what I'm claiming, that, you know, all these other kinds of more mundane, less metaphysical themes like catharsis, forgiveness, self-compassion, and so on, are at least as salient as classical mystical content. So in short, I think you get from the qualitative evidence the beginnings of a fairly convincing argument against the metaphysical belief theory. Similarly, again, this is a study, actually an end-of-life one. This is LSD for anxiety and depression in a terminal illness. And here you have things like altered emotional experience, loosening of ego functions, new perspectives and reductions of rumination. So again, no kind of joyous cosmology or grand metaphysical beliefs in sight. So let's look for another theory. Well, one theory is that the experience isn't what's doing the work at all. It's actually non-experiential processes at a purely neurobiological level. And I hate to have to rush through this because there are a number of interesting issues that come up when you try and look at this theory. Basically, you can interpret it in a few different ways, and so you can treat the neuroplasticity theory of psychedelic therapy as being consistent with all these psychological theories and just describing the same process at a different level of resolution. But there is a version of it which genuinely conflicts with the psychological theories and says, look, from a therapeutic standpoint, the experience itself is not what's doing most of the work. Most of it is genuinely non-experiential neurobiological processes. In brief, the problem with this view, I think, is all this psychometric evidence correlating aspects of the acute experience with aspects of the clinical outcomes. That all seems to me very hard to explain if the experience isn't doing much of the work, and extremely easy to explain if it is. And also, I think it's worth noting that even in healthy subjects, psychedelic experience targets all these factors that are independently implicated in relevant pathologies, right? So psychedelic experience features changes to self-representation, emotional processing, attention and salience, psychological flexibility, all these cognitive capacities that are known to be altered in all the conditions for which psychedelic therapy shows promise. So I think these considerations and more add up to a strong case against the pure neuroplasticity theory. I think what's going on in psychedelic therapy is genuinely psychological. It really is some psychological process catalyzed by the experience itself that is doing the work. So then we come to the famous rebus model, Carhart, Harris, and Friston. This is rooted in predictive processing theory. In a nutshell, this says that, you know, the brain is a hierarchical system, and at the very highest levels of the processing hierarchy, we have all these extremely general and abstract beliefs that are usually unconscious but structure our experience. So beliefs about the self and space and time and causation and things like this. And the claim is that psychedelic experience, especially at high doses, fundamentally involves a relaxing of these abstract high-level beliefs. So psychedelics disrupt the functioning of the systems that encode our deepest, most fundamental assumptions about self and world. And this is the key not only to their acute phenomenological effects, but to their therapeutic potential. So Carhart, Harris, and Friston say, look, in all these pathologies, plausibly, we have maladaptive beliefs that kind of become entrenched. And so by relaxing those beliefs, psychedelics afford an opportunity to revise them for the better. So this seems plausible as far as it goes, but I think it just raises further questions, right? Namely, what beliefs exactly are being revised in the existential or palliative care case? I mean, this is actually consistent with the metaphysical belief theory, right? You could combine rebus with the metaphysical belief theory and say, well, the beliefs that are being relaxed and revised are people's beliefs about the ultimate nature of reality. Now, I've already presented evidence suggesting that's not it, so that just raises once again the question, what kinds of beliefs exactly are being relaxed and revised when this treatment works? So my claim is beliefs about the self, right? So I've developed a model of psychedelic experience and psychedelic therapy in collaboration with my colleague, Professor Philip Gerrans, drawing heavily on the work of Thomas Metzinger, among others, which claims that psychedelics unbind predictive models of the self, and this leads to the various alterations in the sense of self that we observe in the acute experience. So all these phenomena like ego dissolution, mystical experience, but also increases in mindfulness, feelings of psychological insight, altered self-perception. According to Philip and I, these all stem from this central basic process of self-unbinding, this disruption to predictive models of the self. And so the claim then becomes, in a way, a special case of the rebus model, whereby Philip and I say that revising pathological self-related beliefs is the core therapeutic mechanism. Now, to me, this seems pretty plausible intuitively when you think about things like depression, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, various forms of addiction or substance use disorder. It's not too hard to imagine in these cases how people's symptoms might be improved by unbinding or disintegrating and then revising for the better their models or representations of the self. But end of life, right? Is it really plausible that people are having their fear of death, their dread of mortality, their existential distress dramatically and durably reduced simply by disintegrating and revising beliefs about the self? Yes. My answer is yes. And I'm going to try and convince you of this in the 2 minutes I have remaining. I don't expect to succeed, but I want to at least try and show that it's not obviously false, right? This could be what's going on. And so one possibility is very simple and very Buddhist in spirit, in fact. And the idea is that a mere liberation of attention from bondage to self-related concerns is enough, right? So the idea would be that this existential predicament, existential dread and distress and so on, is fundamentally maintained by a constant and repeated devotion of attention to the self and its existential predicament. This kind of rigid, inflexible focus on the perils and prospects of a self that is felt to be a very kind of solid, reified entity. And so the thought here is that, you know, it sounds insultingly simple, but basically by liberating attention from this excessive kind of incessant focus on the self, psychedelics might thereby alleviate some of the intense distress that comes along with that constant focus. And indeed, I think there are some qualitative reports that suggest something like this. I hope I've got time to read at least one of them. So here's someone from this LSD study, terminal illness, saying, you know, talking about their psychedelic experience, and they say, it was less about my illness. I was able to put it into perspective, not to see oneself with one's sickness as center. There are more important things in life, the evolution of humankind, for example. Your inner ego gets diminished, I believe, and you are looking at the whole. You are indeed starting to build relations with plants or with the entire living world around. You think less about yourself. You are thinking across borders. And I've got another similar quote here from a different study of psilocybin for terminal illness, but I don't think I've got time to read it. But you just have to take my word for it that it's saying similar kinds of things. And so my basic claim is that reports like this fit much better with the self-unbinding theory, understood as a special case of the rebus model, than with any of the other rivals I considered, especially the metaphysical belief theory and the pure neuroplasticity theory. But of course, more research is required. Thanks.
Thank you for this talk, Chris. And as per usual, this raises sometimes more questions than gives answers. I think this is also what science should do. I would have loved to hear a lot more from Chris, but exactly, we needed to save some time for questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions in the room. Jose, do you have a question from our online audience? No. You wanted to ask something, please. Take the microphone, please.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Chris. Across the ditch in New Zealand, we've just had medically assisted dying approved by a national referendum. And one of the issues that we're facing now is the palliative care fraternity, who've been 95% opposed to medically assisted dying, now needing to sort of change their model. And I think one of the things that might change their model that would make this approach very attractive is that people facing existential distress who might otherwise consider medically assisted dying might have those concerns relieved by such experiences. Do you think that's plausible, and will it happen?
Oh, I mean, I can't really speak to the sort of socio-political institutional questions, but others before me have made the point that it's kind of amazing that there are places in the world where you can get assistance legally to die, but you can't try psychedelics if you're in existential distress, you know? And I agree. I can't remember who said that, but I agree with them that that is an absolutely wild situation. So yeah, I mean, I can't predict what's going to happen in New Zealand, but it definitely does seem like when these experiences can be made available in a safe and controlled fashion, they do help a lot of people.
Yes, I want to make time for one more question. I think I saw you first, actually, yeah?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I really appreciate that you're using qualitative data here. And I have a question coming from my own field of research, which is linguistics. And I was wondering, is there an undergoing project to collect a corpus of qualitative data about the psychedelic experience, and if that would be relevant for the field, and if that could be, if that's already ongoing or not?
Yeah, great question. I know there is a resource online called the Altered States Database that Timo Torsten Schmidt has put together, but I don't know if that includes qualitative data. Does anyone know? I think it might just be quantitative. So yeah, not that I know of. There are parallel things in the case of quantitative research. I think that would be a really cool project. I don't know if there is enough now. Maybe there is if you expand the scope beyond classic psychedelics, but I know when that Brixham et al. Review came out a few years ago, in fact, that was not even restricted to classic psychedelics. That included things like ketamine and MDMA and so on. And then there was enough there that they could just review it in a single paper. I mean, there's always error with, of course. But yeah, no, I think in a more formal scientific context, I think something like that would be a great resource.
Okay, and with that, we have to conclude our Q&A for Chris Letheby. Another round of applause, please.